other rabbit had left. Not in a sudden way, not in a panic. One by one, over the course of about 2 weeks, they had simply stopped coming back. The burrow near the old root system at the edge of the yard, the one that had been occupied through 3 consecutive litters and 2 full seasons, had gone quiet. The warren that had held as many as 7 adults at its peak was empty by the time the first frost came. The field grass had grown over the entrance on the left side. The soil around the main opening had gone undisturbed long enough that the seasonal rains had smoothed out the last paw prints. Except for one. One rabbit kept coming back. Every morning at roughly the same time, it appeared at the far edge of the garden, moved along the fence line in the way it had always moved, paused at the old corner post, and made its way to the burrow entrance. It would sit there for a while, sometimes 10 minutes, sometimes half an hour. It was not foraging. The food near the burrow was largely gone by now. It was not sheltering. The burrow structure had partially collapsed on the east side and was no longer safe to enter fully. It was not doing anything that a rabbit needs to do in order to survive. It was just there. Welcome back. What I want to talk about today is something that happens in the wild that most wildlife biology textbooks do not have a clean category for, and that the people who observe it closely often describe the same way, quietly, and with a kind of hesitation, as if they are not sure they are allowed to say what they are seeing. It involves memory. It involves attachment. It involves a rabbit returning day after day to a place that no longer offers it anything. And it raises a question about what animals carry with them from the places they have lived that I do not think science has finished answering. Stay until the end, because the last thing I want to tell you about this rabbit is the thing that I have not been able to stop thinking about. To understand why a rabbit keeps returning to a place that has stopped serving it, you first need to understand what that place was when it was working. Because home, for a cottontail rabbit, is not a vague concept. It is not a general area. It is a specific, deeply encoded spatial reality that the rabbit has built up over months of lived experience. A cottontail's home range is typically between 1 and 5 acres, depending on habitat quality, season, and population density. Within that range, the rabbit develops what researchers call a cognitive map, a detailed internal representation of the terrain that includes the locations of food sources, water, cover, escape routes, burrow entrances, and the pathways connecting all of them. This map is not static. It is updated continuously with each foraging run, each predator encounter, each seasonal change in the vegetation. But its foundation, the deep structure of it, is laid down in the first weeks and months of the rabbit's life in that territory. And that foundation is not easily overwritten. The burrow at the edge of the yard was the center of this rabbit's map. Not just a location it used, the point around which everything else was oriented. Every foraging route began or ended there. Every threat assessment referenced distance from that entrance. Every return from the exposed open ground of the field resolved into safety by resolving into that specific hollow in the earth under that specific root system. For 2 seasons, the geometry of this rabbit's entire world was organized around one place. When a place like that becomes unavailable, the map does not simply update. This is the part that matters. Studies on spatial memory in small mammals have shown repeatedly that the encoding of primary home sites is qualitatively different from the encoding of secondary locations. The burrow is not just a known place. It is the known place, the reference point against which all other places are measured. When it collapses, when it empties, when the conditions that made it home cease to exist, what remains in the animal's nervous system is not a blank space where the home used to be. What remains is the map, still intact, still pointing to the same coordinates, still organizing the animal's movement around a center that no longer holds what it once held. The rabbit was not confused about what it would find when it arrived. It found exactly what it found every day: the partially collapsed entrance, the absence of the warren, the silence where there used to be the smell and sound and press of other rabbits. It was not expecting something different. It was returning to the coordinates. Because the coordinates were still there, in its nervous system, still pulling. The question of why this particular rabbit stayed when the others left is more nuanced than it first appears. And the answer, as best as the biology can offer one, is not about stubbornness in any human sense of the word. It is about the specific way that different animals within the same population carry different weights of attachment to the same place. The rabbits that left were not making a conscious decision to abandon the burrow. They were responding to a convergence of deteriorating signals that their threat assessment systems process continuously. Reduced food availability in the immediate foraging zone, a partial collapse in the structural integrity of the burrow that changed the scent signature of the entrance and removed its sense of security, increased predator activity in the surrounding area that pushed the risk calculation beyond the threshold that the remaining benefits could justify, and critically, the departure of the other rabbits themselves. A warren that is emptying is a warren that the resident animals can smell emptying. The reduction in social scent, in the layered olfactory signature of a group of animals using the same space, registers as a threat signal of its own. Rabbits are not strictly social animals in the way that some species are, but they are sensitive to the presence of conspecifics in their territory. When those presences disappear one by one, something in the calculation of the remaining animals shifts. For most of them, the shift crossed the threshold at roughly the same time, within a 2-week window, driven by the same accumulation of deteriorating conditions. They moved. They redistributed into adjacent territories. They found other burrows, other warrens, other centers around which to rebuild their maps. This one did not cross that threshold, or it crossed it differently. The question is why? There are several possible answers, and they are not mutually exclusive. The first is age. Older rabbits show stronger site fidelity than younger ones. The encoding of a primary home site deepens with repeated use over time, and the longer an animal has organized its world around a specific location, the more resistant that encoding appears to be to the signals that would normally prompt dispersal. If this rabbit was among the older residents of the warren, its attachment to the location may simply have been more deeply written than the others. The second possible answer is reproductive history. Research on small mammal site fidelity has found that animals that have successfully raised young in a specific location show elevated attachment to that location in subsequent seasons, even after the structural conditions that made it a good nest site have deteriorated. Something in the experience of successful reproduction at a place encodes that place differently, not just as home, as the place where something essential happened. Whether this constitutes memory in any meaningful sense, whether the rabbit carries anything like what we would call the experience of having raised young in that hollow under those roots, the researchers are careful about this, but the behavioral data is consistent. The place pulls harder afterward than it did before. By the time the first hard frost arrived, the rabbit's daily return to the burrow had become genuinely costly in ways that were accumulating toward a serious problem. The food situation first. The vegetation around the burrow had been heavily grazed through 2 seasons of rabbit activity. The clover and grass that had sustained the warren through summer and into early autumn was cropped down to bare soil across a radius of 30 feet from the entrance. In a functional warren, rabbits compensate for this by expanding their foraging range collectively, with multiple animals covering more ground and returning with information about food availability across a wider area. A single rabbit maintaining a fixed route to a depleted location does not have that collective range. It was eating what it could find on its regular circuit, which was less than it had been eating 2 months earlier, and the gap between what it was burning on the daily return journey and what it was finding on the forage was growing wider each week. The predator situation second. An occupied warren is a warren that runs active alarm systems. Multiple animals, with overlapping sensory coverage, each one monitoring a different arc of the surrounding territory, each one capable of triggering a retreat that warns all the others. A rabbit alone has only its own ears, its own nose, its own 360-degree field of vision. Everything that would have been distributed across several animals is now concentrated in one, and the daily return to the same location at roughly the same time on the same route, which is the pattern this rabbit had settled into, is a pattern that the predators in the area were beginning to read. The fox that had been working the eastern edge of the field had noted the rabbit's regular morning appearance at the old Burrow site within 4 days of the rabbit beginning to return alone. Not because the fox had planned anything, because a fox's territorial intelligence files away patterns the way we might file away a useful phone number. There is a rabbit. It appears here, at roughly this time, alone. The fox had not yet acted on this information, but it had it. And there was a third cost that is harder to quantify, but that I think matters in this story. The burrow was no longer structurally sound, but the rabbit was still attempting to use it, partly because the alternative, sleeping in open secondary cover, elevated its exposure to everything it was already more exposed to as a lone animal. But the partial collapse on the east side had narrowed the interior in ways that compromised the exits. A rabbit in a sound burrow has options. It can go deeper. It can exit from a secondary entrance. It can press itself into a far corner that a larger animal cannot reach. A rabbit in a partially collapsed burrow has fewer of those options, and it may not know which ones it has lost until the moment it needs them. It kept coming back anyway, every morning. The same route, the same pause at the corner post, the same arrival at the entrance that was slowly being reclaimed by the earth around it. There is a window in the life of a rabbit in declining habitat when dispersal is still a viable option, when the adjacent territories have enough availability to absorb a new resident, when the rabbit's own body condition is good enough to sustain the increased exposure and energy cost of establishing a new home range, when the cognitive map, however deeply written, is still plastic enough to be recentered around a new location. That window is not unlimited. It narrows as the season progresses, as food becomes scarcer, as the rabbit's condition deteriorates incrementally, as the days shorten and the temperature drops, and the cost of everything a rabbit does outside the burrow increases. This rabbit was still inside that window in the first weeks after the others left. A researcher observing it then would have said the prognosis was uncertain, but not hopeless. The food was depleted, but not gone. The body condition was slightly reduced, but functional. The predator pressure was elevated, but not yet focused. There were adjacent territories within its established range that showed better habitat conditions. The window was open. But the rabbit did not move through it. Each morning it returned to the old entrance. Each return was a day not spent exploring and mapping alternative sites. Each day spent on the depleted foraging circuit around the burrow was a day the body condition declined by a fraction and the window narrowed by a fraction, and the energy required to disperse successfully became a slightly larger proportion of the reserves available. The decision not to leave, or whatever is the non-decision equivalent of that, in an animal that does not deliberate the way we deliberate, compounded. Not dramatically, not in any single day that you could point to as the turning point, just quietly, by fractions, in the way that most irreversible things happen. By the time the second hard frost arrived, the window had closed to something narrower than optimal. Not impossible, but the calculus had shifted. A dispersal attempt now would cost more than a dispersal attempt 6 weeks ago. The rabbit would be covering unfamiliar ground, in deteriorating weather, in reduced body condition, with a predator who had been observing its pattern for over a month. The very attachment that had kept it at the burrow had made the alternative to the burrow more dangerous. This is how these situations work, not through a single catastrophic mistake, through the slow foreclosure of options by a series of individually small choices that each made perfect sense in the moment they were made. I want to step back from the specific situation of this rabbit for a moment, because I think there is something worth examining more carefully in the idea of what it is doing when it returns to the burrow entrance every morning. The word memory is a complicated one to use about a rabbit. The scientific literature is careful about this, and I think it is right to be careful. We do not know what a rabbit experiences when it sits at the entrance of a place where it spent 2 seasons of its life. We do not know whether there is any subjective content to that return, any sense of recognition or loss or longing that constitutes experience in a way that resembles what we mean when we use those words. The question of animal consciousness, and specifically of the relationship between spatial memory and subjective experience in small mammals, is genuinely open. Anyone who tells you it is settled in either direction is telling you more than the data supports. What we do know is the behavior, and the behavior is this. The rabbit returns, every day, to a place that no longer provides food, no longer provides safe shelter, no longer provides the social context of a functioning warren. It arrives at roughly the same time. It sits at the entrance for a period of time that varies, but is always longer than any functional purpose would require. And then it leaves, and comes back the next day, and does the same thing. In human beings, we have a word for the behavior of returning repeatedly to a place associated with significant experience, particularly loss. We call it grief. We call it the pull of memory. We call it the inability to accept that something is gone. We call it all of these things, and we treat them as distinct but related expressions of the same underlying reality, which is that the places where our most significant experiences happened are not just locations in space, they are locations in the self. And something in us, something that is not entirely rational and not entirely subject to the kind of updating that conscious thought can perform, keeps returning to them long after the return serves any practical purpose. I am not going to tell you that this rabbit is grieving. I do not know that, and I think claiming to know it would be doing something dishonest with the genuine uncertainty that surrounds this question. What I will tell you is that the behavior is indistinguishable, from the outside, from what grief looks like in the animals we know to grieve. The return, the sitting, the departure, the return again the next day. If an elephant did this at the bones of a dead companion, we would not hesitate to use the word. The rabbit is smaller, the neurology is different, the capacity for subjective experience is less certain, but the behavior is the same shape. I want to tell you about the last morning I have information about, because it matters to the shape of this story, and I think you should have it. It was late in the 2nd month after the warren had emptied. The frost was heavier than it had been, the grass along the fence line, the route the rabbit had walked every morning for weeks, was stiff and white in the pre-dawn cold. The rabbit appeared at the far edge of the garden at its usual time, moved along the fence in its usual way, paused at the corner post, as it always did. But on this morning, it did not go to the burrow entrance. It sat at the corner post for longer than usual. 4 minutes, maybe 5, and then it turned and moved in a direction it had not taken on any of the previous mornings. Not toward the burrow, toward the hedge at the northern edge of the yard, the dense, overgrown section where the privet had gone untrimmed for 2 seasons, and the gap between the bottom of the hedge and the soil had widened into the kind of low, dark space that a rabbit can move through without being seen from above. It went through the hedge, and it did not come back that morning. I do not know what happened after that. I do not know if it found a new territory. I do not know if it established a new burrow somewhere in the adjacent land, if there was adjacent land suitable enough to support it, if the window that had been narrowing was still open enough for it to pass through. I do not know if the fox found it on that first day in unfamiliar ground, or if it made it far enough to find cover and rest and begin the slow work of building a new map around a new center. I do not have that information. The story ends at the hedge. But here is what I think matters about that last morning. The rabbit sat at the corner post for 5 minutes, which was longer than it had ever paused there before, and it did not go to the burrow. Whatever pulled it there every morning for weeks, whatever the coordinates in its nervous system had been pointing toward, on this particular morning at this particular corner post in this particular cold, something shifted. Something in the balance between the pull of the place it had always gone and whatever impulse toward survival was still running underneath the attachment tilted, just enough, just barely enough, toward the hedge. I do not know if it survived, but it moved. After all those mornings of returning to a place that no longer held anything for it, it moved toward something that might. I said at the beginning that I have not been able to stop thinking about this rabbit. I want to tell you why. It is not the biology, though the biology is extraordinary. It is not the predator pressure or the depleted food supply or the partially collapsed burrow or any of the specific conditions of this particular animal's situation. It is the image of the rabbit at the corner post on the last morning, sitting there for 5 minutes in the frost, and then turning toward the hedge instead. Most of us have a corner post, a place we keep returning to that no longer holds what it held when we first oriented ourselves around it. A relationship that ended, a home we left, a version of our life that stopped being available to us, a person we can no longer reach, something that our internal map still points toward even after the thing it pointed to is gone. And most of us know something about the specific pull of that returning, the way it is not quite rational, the way it does not respond to the reasonable argument that the place is empty now, that going back does not give you what you are going back for. The way the coordinates just keep being there, in your chest, pointing. The rabbit was not being foolish. It was not being stubborn in any way that deserves criticism. It was doing what the weight of its own experience required of it, returning to the place that had been most real, most central, most alive in its history, because that place still existed in the map, even after it stopped existing in the field. This is not a failure of the rabbit's intelligence. In some ways, it is the most honest thing the rabbit did. It went back because the place still mattered. It went back because something in it had not finished with that place yet. And then one morning it did not go back. Not because it had stopped caring, because something else, something toward the future rather than toward the past, became just strong enough to tip the balance. Just enough. At the corner post. In the frost. I think about that a lot. The idea that the movement away from the place you keep returning to is not a betrayal of what that place was. It is the thing that allows whatever that place gave you to carry forward. The rabbit did not leave the burrow behind when it went through the hedge. It took everything the burrow had been with it. The map, the memory, the weight of 2 seasons spent in that particular hollow under those particular roots. It took all of it, and it moved. Tell me in the comments, have you ever watched an animal in your yard doing something you could not fully explain? Something that felt like more than instinct, more than habit? Or is there a place you keep going back to yourself, a corner post of your own that you are still standing at some mornings? I want to hear it. I read every one of them. And this community holds stories like that with more care than most places will. If this found you at a moment when you needed it, share it with someone else who might need it too. Sometimes, the right story at the right time is the thing that helps you turn toward the hedge. I will see you in the next one.